She would never let on, but I will tell you that she does not feel well this morning. So we certainly appreciate it today. All right. Time to go back to 2 Timothy chapter 3. We should finish this. I do try to plan the preaching a little bit. Some people may think that's not necessarily spiritual. I don't see how that's the case. But we should finish this next week, just ahead of the business meeting, etc. And after we get the business meeting and Lord's Supper, I'll probably have decided prayerfully that we're going to start looking for a few weeks, just quick sort of overview at the believer's resurrection. And the reason is I've been wanting to get to the rapture. And that's going to be our next sort of drawn-out study. Not as long as the previous one was, but so we're working our way there. But we're going to finish this passage first. I've wanted to preach through this passage for years. I hope that you've been learning something and been enjoying it. But we should start to really wind it up today. 2 Timothy chapter 3, talking about these perilous times and perilous men. Paul warns us in the beginning of this chapter that we are to know and understand that perilous times are coming upon us in this age that we live in. And by perilous, he means times that are extremely dangerous to our faith. And that these times are going to be brought on by men who are dangerous to our faith. He describes what they're like in verses 2, 3, and 4. And then he tells us in verse 5 that they have this form of godliness but deny its power. We learn that these guys he's talking about are false ministers of Christ. And they use a false ministry and a false gospel, he said last week, to creep into people's families through weak and the term he used was silly women. By that, he meant that they target their victims, okay? And not exclusively women, but they do. They target their victims, people who are, he said, loaded down with sins and led away by various lusts, and they learn, but they never quite get to the truth. And they want to hear the message these guys have to offer. And this is how they target families. And what we're going to see as we start to wind up today in verses 8 and 9 is sort of, we've kind of seen, who they are and what they're doing. We've seen to some extent why they do what they do. But really in verse 8, this is going to be driven home, okay? The heart of the matter, why it is they're like this, and why they're trying to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish. And it has everything to do with opposition to God. If you look at your outline on the back of your bulletin, you'll see the way they work. They use a false ministry to sort of target weak people, and they do all of this in opposition to God. And that is really the main sort of characteristic as we begin to close here. He says in verse 8, just as Jannes and Jambres resisted Moses, so do these also resist the truth. Men of corrupt minds disapprove concerning the faith. And that's where we are in regard to their motivation. I have told you before, I think last week, that the men that we're dealing with in this passage are particularly insidious because they know what they're doing. These aren't people who are mistaken. There are some people who, while they are lost, they do think they're saved. And sort of what they're doing is sincere, even though it's sincerely wrong. They're lost, but they are sincere in their religion. They're just unaware of their true condition. That is not what's going on here. The people we're talking about in 2 Timothy chapter 3, they know that they are false ministers, and they know what they're doing, and they're using the appearance of godliness to get gain. In reality, what they're doing is they're opposing God. They're fighting against God. And in their war against God, you are the prize. And so they're exercising this false ministry, victimizing weak and sinful people in order to, at least in part, fight against God. And so you might say to yourself, well, why in the world would someone fight against God? And how do they think they can possibly fight against God? Well, we've already seen the main characteristic of these guys is that what? They love themselves. Right? And so because they love and worship themselves, what does that immediately make God? He's a rival. Now, we see that these guys in 2 Timothy chapter 3 aren't the first people to do it, right? Ever since mankind walked out of the garden, there's been sort of this long war against God and a long line of people who've tried to fight him. Cain tried to fight him. He was probably one of the first. Remember what he did to his brother Abel in order to do what he wanted rather than what God wanted? You see right there in that example a pattern. Cain wanted what he wanted more than he wanted what God wanted, and it cost his brother his life. His brother was his victim in his war against God. Cain isn't the only one. Think of Nimrod in Babel. Guy that decided to fight against God. Stopped in the middle of the desert where he found a suitable place to stop when God had told him to go and scatter out and build a tower to heaven to make a name for himself. And what happened? God comes down, confuses the languages of all humanity, and scatters them all over the world. All humanity is a victim in Nimrod's personal war against God. And you keep going all the way into the New Testament. It happens over and over and over. Pharaoh, Exodus, right? A man who's at war against God. And what does it cost him? Everybody in Egypt, all of these plagues and suffering. And so what we see is repeatedly there are men who are sort of in a war, a personal war against God. And the problem is that everybody around them, especially when they're in leadership position, like these guys would be in churches, everybody around them becomes the victim of that private war. And you are the prize in this private war. And what we're going to see today in verse 8 is that the comparison Paul makes in this passage to two men in particular who were famous enemies of God show you exactly what they're up to. And we know what they're doing, and we know how they're doing it. But today, in verse 8, we get at the heart of why they're doing it. Okay? And we see that, as I said, in verse 8. Paul says, "Now just as Jannes and Jambres resisted God, so do these also resist the truth." Let's stop right there. That word resist is the reason they're doing what they're doing. But why does Paul bring up these two guys we've never heard of, Jannes and Jambres? Well, it's unknown with 100% certainty who these two guys are, but I think we probably have about 98% certainty of who these guys are. You see in Paul's statement here, they're connected to Moses. And so whatever happened, happened back at that time. But these people's names don't appear anywhere else in the Bible except in Paul's statement right here. Where we learn about these two guys are in some ancient Jewish writings that are called the Targums. Targums. Get familiar with that, the Targums. And what the Targums are, and they are still used today to some extent, what the Targums are is in the first century, right after Jesus died and rose from the grave, Rome came and destroyed Jerusalem. You might remember that. Happened in AD 70. I mean, not experientially remember it, but you might have heard the story. In 70 AD, Rome comes and destroys Jerusalem. Jews are scattered once again all over the world. What comes out of this are the rabbis. Okay? Now, the rabbis existed before this, but this is where they sort of came to what we understand they are today, right? Synagogues and rabbis and they're leaders of the Jewish people. And so one of the things that happened is that these books started to pop up called Targums. And what Targums were copies of the Old Testament in plain language. You can sort of think of the Targums as the NIVs or the New Living Translations of their day. And one of the things that would happen in the Targums is they weren't in Hebrew, they were in Aramaic, because that was the sort of common language of the Jews at that time. Not only would they translate the Bible or the Scriptures, but as they translated them, they would sort of comment on them too. So you have sort of this mixture of Scripture and thoughts. And that's what the Targums are. Now, in one particular Targum called the Targum of Jonathan, he mentions in Exodus chapter 7 and verse 11 these two guys by name. Okay? If you look at Exodus 7:11, you can flip there if you want to. I'll read it to you. In Exodus chapter 7 and verse 11, our Bible says this. I'll read it real quick. It says, let me get this. It says, "A Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, so the magicians of Egypt, they also did in like manner with their enchantments." You remember that the first time Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh, God gave him a sign. He said, "Throw down your staff and it'll turn into a snake." And he did that. Remember that story? Okay. Immediately in that story, in the verse we just read, Exodus chapter 7, Pharaoh calls Egypt's magicians and they duplicate the miracle. They throw down their staffs and they become serpents too, and then Aaron's serpent, or their serpent, eats their serpents. When you read this verse in the Targums, here's what it says. "But Pharaoh called the Hakims and magicians, and they also, Jannes and Jambres, magicians of Mizraim, did the same by their burnings of divination." Boom, there you are. That's where we learned their names. It wasn't from the Bible, but it was from other ancient Jewish writings at the time. And so what we learn is the names of the guys who opposed Moses in Pharaoh's court are Jannes and Jambres. And what Paul says here back in our passage, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, these men opposed truth. He uses Jannes and Jambres as an example of what these two guys are doing. And so Paul believed that was their names, and he believed it enough to tell us that was their names, but their names aren't really significant. What they do is what Paul wants us to understand. He says in verse 8, "In the same way that Jannes and Jambres resisted Moses, these men resist the truth." And that word resist is important because it tells us why they are doing all these. Right? You may have already questioned, as we've studied this passage, why would anybody do these? This is why. Because they resist the truth. They resist the truth. That word in Greek is two words shoved together. We have those even in English, compound words. And what it means is stand against. In fact, I don't think the word resist here, if you're reading the King James, it says opposed. I don't think either of those words are as strong as what Paul meant them to mean in the English language. What he actually said when he wrote this was, these two men stood against Moses. He's trying to communicate the force with which they fought against Moses. It's combat language. You ever see one of these old movies about maybe the medieval times or the Dark Ages, and you have two armies on the field ready to go to battle, but they haven't gone to battle yet? And when the word is given, what's the first thing they do? They take up a position. They dig in. They're standing firm is what it's called. And that's what Paul pictures these two guys were doing against Moses. It's a war. And that's how Paul saw it when he wrote it, and that's sort of what he's trying to communicate to us. There's a war. These guys aren't just opposed to Moses. They're not just resisting what Moses is trying to do. They see themselves in a war against Moses. And Paul says, just like these two were in a war against Moses, the guys I'm talking about are in a war against truth. They are actively fighting it. They're not just opposed to it. They don't just resist it. They are out to destroy truth on purpose. And so what Paul says here is he wants us to understand that these people, in the same way that Jannes and Jambres stood against Moses, they are standing against truth. That's the message Paul wants you to get. Now it's interesting that this word standing against here is the same thing we are instructed to do several times in the New Testament in regards to evil. I want you to keep your place there. I'm going to take you to another verse, and I'll share. Go back to the book of Ephesians chapter 6. Oh, I know you're familiar with this passage, but I want to read it anyway. I want to point something out to you. Ephesians chapter 6. We're going to read verses 11 through 14. It's very interesting that the same instructions Paul gives us how we should view evil is the warning he's given us about how these people view you and view truth, and by extension view God. In Ephesians chapter 6, look at what Paul, and he'll say it several times here. You'll catch it now that I've pointed it out. You'll catch it right immediately. In Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 10, he says, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God so that you may be what? Stand against. Same word. He's talking about wearing armor. He's talking about fighting. He's telling you to stand against something. He's telling you to go to war against something. He goes on to say you stand against the wiles of the devil, because we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the dark rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Verse 13, therefore take up the whole armor of God so that you may be able to withstand. Same thing. Verse 14, stand therefore. Same word. He's talking about a fight. And that's what he means about these two guys over in our other passage. These men that he is warning us about, they're not just take it or leave it, right, where truth is concerned. They're not just sort of, well, it's not for me, but if that's your thing. They're in a war against truth. They're in a personal war against God. And you are the prize of this battle. Similar language is used. James chapter 4 and verse 7. James tells us, submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Same word. 1 Peter chapter 5, he says, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, whom resist steadfastly in the faith. This is a war. And all throughout the New Testament, we are repeatedly reminded we are in a fight. And the reward is our souls and the souls of other men. And so Paul, back in our passage, tells us the reason these guys are doing this is they're in a fight. But their fight is with truth. And that means, by extension, their fight is with Christ. Their fight is with God. Paul's point is this. The men he is warning us about are doing exactly what Jannes and Jambres were doing. They are in a war against God, and you're the prize. Now here's why that's significant. Look at what he says back in our passage at the second part, sort of verse 8. Now, as Jannes and Jambres resisted Moses, so do these also resist the truth. They have actively taken a stand against the truth. They know that the gospel is truth. They know it is. They knew that Moses was sent from God in Pharaoh's court and decided to go to war against him. And these men understand that the gospel that you have believed, they understand that it is the truth. They understand that it has come from God, and they have chosen to fight it. How? Paul says the same way Jannes and Jambres fought it. Through imitation. Through imitation. What is it that Jannes and Jambres did? They did what Moses did. Right? They did the same stuff Moses did. They looked like Moses in that way. What did Paul say already about these guys back in verse 5? They have a form of godliness. They have a form of godliness. What these guys do is imitate the real thing in order to discredit the real thing, in order to destroy its reputation and to sort of eliminate its influence. Let me give you an example of what they do. We talked last week about they use the gospel to do it to people who are already in sin and being led away by various lusts. Here's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where a minister of the gospel would tell you, deny yourself, take up the cross and follow Christ. These men will say stuff like, listen, you don't really need to deny yourself. God loves you. And here's what he wants. He wants you to love yourself. He wants you to feel good about yourself. You don't have to be in all this shame and guilt over your sin, and you don't need to fear God because he loves you. You see how close that is to the gospel message? There's elements of truth in that ridiculous statement I just made. And that's how they do what they do. They know the truth, and they will come so close to it that it looks and sounds almost just like it in order to discredit the truth. And what happens is when you can discredit the truth, you can eliminate the influence of the truth. What do you think happened when Moses walked in there and threw down that rod and it turned into a snake? They went, whoa, wait, what? And then when Jannes and Jambres walked in and did the same thing, they went, oh. That's how they work. Okay? In their personal war against God, they resist the truth by imitating the truth. Because if you can do that, you can discredit the truth. And when you discredit the truth, it has no more influence over you. It doesn't care. You don't care. It doesn't matter. You see it as irrelevant. Where a gospel minister might tell you, you need to obey God, they might say something like, Jesus came to show us another way. God's forgiving. He understands, right? That you make mistakes and you want all these things and you're going to fail and He's on your side. See how close that is to the gospel message? Comes right up to the line and is yet so far off at the same time. But it imitates truth. And it sounds really good to people who want to disobey anyway, right? Verse 7, people. And it's in that way that they discredit truth and oppose God. God says one thing, I say another. That's how they oppose God. And they do it by closely imitating the truth. Because if they can discredit truth, they can eliminate its influence. Keep your place here, because I think we're on. And just go backwards a few pages to 1 Timothy chapter 4. I want to show you something. 1 Timothy chapter 4. We see them doing this here in 1 Timothy chapter 4. Learn to recognize. You have to be able to distinguish the gospel message from all other messages, right? Because it's the only way you're going to be able to distinguish the person who's delivering it. Look at what Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 4. We're sort of along the same lines here. He says this, now the Spirit expressly says, that is, the Spirit of God had told him, that in the latter times, that's funny, that's sort of the same thing he said over there in the last days, right? Same thing, that's what he's talking about. In the latter time, some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. Now look at verse 2. Speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their own consciences seared as with a hot iron. That's what they're doing. Okay? The warning back over in our other passage about resisting the truth, this is how they resist it. They speak lies in hypocrisy. Because he says their own consciences have been seared with a hot iron. What does he mean by that? That they have put themselves in a position that they no longer feel any fear of God, any guilt, any shame in preaching lies that they know are lies on purpose in order to deceive people around them. And they put themselves in a position by rejecting truth so long that it no longer matters to them, that they know good and well what they're doing and aren't doing it, right? And they feel no shame, no guilt, no remorse, no fear. Their conscience is like it's been cauterized, it's been burned. And they can't feel any of the things that would be associated with doing what they're doing to people. And they don't care because above all, they love themselves. And what they need to do is eliminate truth, thereby eliminating God. And then all of a sudden, you belong to them. And that's how they do what they do. That's why they're doing what they do. Notice that he says that the Spirit has told them that in the latter times, they will depart from the faith, having given heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. Here's what I want to point out about that. Whatever men tell you that aren't the gospel, this is the source. Okay? Deceiving spirits, doctrines of demons. And so when someone comes at you with a message that's very close to the gospel, like the examples I gave, but I can keep giving examples, right? Messages that are very close to the gospel, but somehow at the same time a million miles away, you need to understand those messages originated in hell. And even though these are the guys that are preaching them, the messages originated in hell. You might remember a couple weeks ago that Paul compared these guys in Corinthians to ministers of Satan. Well, just as if you have a minister of God, the message he's sharing originates where? Somewhere else. He's just sharing it. Same thing is true with these guys. The message they're preaching originated with demons and devils. They're just using it to capture you away from God because they hate Him. And they're in it for themselves. Now, real quick, we need to finish up. Let's go back to our passage, and I'll just take a couple of moments. We'll just finish verse 8 real quick. He says this, these men resist the truth. That's why they are doing this. They're in a war against God. He describes them then in the rest of this verse. He says they are men of corrupt minds, disapproved concerning the faith. They are men of corrupt minds, disapproved concerning the faith. I wonder if any of you remember weeks and weeks and weeks ago when we were doing that long study on sin, I talked about the corrupting influence of sin. And when you read that word corrupt in the Bible, it means rot. It means something that's rotting. That's you can literally say the word rotting there. Okay, when you see the word corrupt in the New Testament. And he says that these men are men whose minds are rotted out. They have rotted away. Sin has so corrupted their minds, right, that he says back over here in 1 Timothy, what? It's like their conscience has been cauterized. Sin has had its way with them to the point that they no longer feel or think anything about what they're doing. It doesn't matter to them. And so that knowing that, it means they'll do anything they have to do. This word corrupted here in Greek means to be completely rotted away. The literal translation is it's entirely spoiled. It has been their minds have been entirely spoiled to the point that they have no conscience about what they're doing to you anymore. He goes on to say that they are disapproved concerning the faith. This is his final statement on their condition. We won't go back to them after this, even though next week we're going to get in verse 9. His final statement on their condition. They're disapproved concerning the faith. That means they have failed to pass the test. This was a term used when referring to gold and precious metals. Right? There were tests that can be done to see whether something is what it appears to be or not. And he says that's not true with these guys. They have failed to pass the test. They're counterfeit. They're worthless. And they have been rejected, that is, by God. And so having rejected the truth to the extent that Paul describes, they themselves have been rejected. These men are unredeemable. And that's the difference that I started mentioning last week and I opened up with this week. These aren't guys who mean well, they're just off a little bit. There are some people like that. They do mean well. They're just off maybe here and there about this and that. Not saying they're entirely harmless, but that's not what's going on in this passage. You have guys here who have so given themselves to the love of themselves that sin has rotted away their capacity to even feel guilty about what they're willing to do to you to build their own kingdom in their war against God. That's who you're dealing with. These men are evil. They're not well-meaning but mistaken. And they're not just got some growing up to do spiritually. They are men who are in a war against God. You are the prize, and they don't even care that any of that is the case. They just want what they want. That's why Paul says they are what? Perilous. Perilous. A man or woman by extension who has no feelings where you are concerned, that they want what they want to the extent they'll do anything to you to get it, that's a dangerous person. And they're doubly dangerous when they're standing behind the pulpit telling you what God thinks and wants. And that's what Paul is warning us about in that passage. That's how or why they do what they do. They're in a personal war against God. You are the prize. That's why he's warning us about these people. Next week, Lord's will, we'll finish up in verse 9 by looking at what's going to happen to them. And that's going to be its own fantastic study. But for today, that's as far as we're going to be able to go. Let's have a word of prayer.